Thanks for making Locked On Nets your first listen of the day. We've got a packed podcast for you, buddy. I'm feeling bummed out. Are you going to make me feel any better here?
In time, maybe off air, but the first thing we have to do is address the Sean Marks first press release that outlined what their stance is going to be with Kyrie Irving. Not available to participate with the team in any form or fashion. Followed it up with a media session where we got some more details and we try to dissect the information, take away what we can from it. But ultimately, yeah, be bummed out. We're not going to have any Kyrie this year. So saddle up, friends. We're going to take you all the way down to the bottom of the well.
It's not the news you wanted to hear on a Tuesday. It's obviously really important for how the Nets season starts shaping up. We're going to break it all down here. First, the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I'm Doug Norrie. Give us, the Royal Us, a follow over at Doug Norrie on Twitter, owner-operator DFSR.com. Got you covered for your NBA projections over there. And that is Adam Armbrecht. Give him a follow at Adam Armbrecht on Twitter. Also the host of the One Giant podcast covering the New York Football Giants, or what's left of them. Buddy, how are we doing? We're recording this just for, honestly, we're recording this on Tuesday afternoon. It'll be up on Wednesday, up on YouTube right away, though. Buddy, how are we doing on a Tuesday afternoon? Most people that are listening to this will hear it on a Wednesday.
We're feeling fantastic. We had said we were going to come back in for the next episode with some more takeaways from preseason game number 3. But if we had wondered what was going to happen with Kyrie Irving and the circumstances around his availability, somewhat out of nowhere, we get a press release from Sean Marks and then followed up with a media session to address some of the questions from reporters, et cetera, and get a little bit more details on it. But we now get clarification about where the Brooklyn Nets stand on Kyrie Irving and his possible part-time availability, basically not being something that the Brooklyn Nets were willing to enter into the regular season as being an option for them on the table.
Yeah, we've been sort of trending toward this direction for a little bit now. It's been this waiting game around what's going to happen with Kyrie Irving heading into the season. The 2-second Cliff's notes are that he has not been vaccinated under the guidelines presented by the state of New York, and specifically New York City. Unvaccinated players that are playing within the 5 boroughs, in this case in Brooklyn, cannot play home games. The Nets had actually gotten a waiver that said Kyrie Irving was going to be able to practice. This actually was something we didn't talk about yesterday, but they had been granted a waiver by the city that said that their practice facility was a private building, therefore did not need to adhere to any vaccine guidelines. And so that actually, when that came out on Tuesday, you start thinking, oh, we're headed for something. We're headed in the right direction here, right? He's going to be in Brooklyn. He's going to be practicing. We'll see where he'll be back with the team. We'll see where it goes from there. And then we go a complete 180 from that on Tuesday afternoon when the Nets drop the announcement that they are just going to be not with Kyrie Irving's services until he's vaccinated. And that's pretty much where they drew the line.
Yeah, it was interesting too because we had covered Joseph Tsai and the Brian Lewis interview and that very direct kind of, hey, we want you to get vaccinated to be a part of the team fully. But when we didn't really see any movement on it or hear anything from Kyrie's side of it, we kind of, I think we, at least what I wondered aloud, the Nets are trying to take this hard line. They're trying to push Kyrie in the direction that they want. And it looked like Kyrie was willing to dig his heels in. And I was getting closer to the point of, because we heard Steve Nash answer the question as, yeah, we're preparing to not have him for home games. That was just said at a practice within the last 2 days. So it seemed like the Nets were accepting what was going to be the situation going into the season, where they would have him on road games and have to try to figure out everything that it was going to take when they were at Barclays and obviously when they would play the Knicks during the year. So, I mean, were you surprised? We're going to get into the statement from Sean Marks and some of the questions that he fielded afterwards, but were you surprised that this ended up being the direction that the Brooklyn Nets went? Because I almost kind of thought that, it's a star-driven league. This was the Nets pushing as hard as they possibly could to get the result that they obviously desired. I thought that it was kind of waving the white flag and accepting what the circumstances were going to be going into this year.
Yeah, I really thought it after the practice facility thing changed on Monday. I actually really thought I said because they had clearly that meant they were lobbying for that, right? They had put in some kind of waiver that said, "Hey, we want this to be a different designation because that's not a public venue. In this case, we're a private organization. We can sort of do things as we see fit, and if we want to allow unvaccinated people into the facility, then that's our choice, as a lot of businesses have done." So when
Mhm.
it went that direction, it really seemed like we were moving in a direction of him being like that seemed to be the timeline or the curve to bring him back into the fold, right? Like, oh, he comes back
Yeah.
to practice, and maybe him being at practice means he doesn't want to sit half the games, right? And like he doesn't like now that he's here for this part, he wants to be there for all. But that second part, I'm just doing in my own head. That's my own mental gymnastics, which is
Right.
better. By the way, with Kyrie Irving, has been proven to not try to don't do that, because you really never get to the same conclusions. But yeah, so I was really surprised by this. It's really a bummer of a situation from all sides, I think, and I don't know. I think I had set out a week ago, um, that you had to really, as a Nets fan, start thinking in a non-0% chance of Kyrie Irving not playing the whole season, right?
Mhm.
I didn't think it was a likelihood. I would have put it at a low percentage at the time, but it was more than zero. As
Mhm.
of after all those first sets of comments that came out, and the organization clearly starting to take a hard line. We talked about this a ton last week. I started in my mind that number kept creeping up, 5%, 8%, something like that, and now it's got to be way higher than that, right? And we'll get through some of the things that Mark said, but they left no there's no room here at all now, for him to come back if he doesn't get the vaccine. Like, that's it. It's over. Like any little bits of information that seemed like they were trending in the the correct direction for him coming back to the court, those were wiped away completely Tuesday afternoon.
Yeah, and there's some overarching things that weren't really covered today that I think are the big picture questions of what if circumstances change in New York City? What if the guidelines change? How will that impact this? I wonder, and we're not going to probably get to it today, of how concrete are both sides going to feel about this versus if things changed, what does that mean for Kyrie? What does it mean for the Brooklyn Nets, et cetera? So it's like this very much gives us the current state of affairs. We have a strong sense of how the season is going to start and what it looks like for the Brooklyn Nets, but there's still going to be background narratives to it that I just do have kind of, you said, doing some gymnastics in my head around other things that could come up. But for the time being, what did the initial statement from Sean Marks that was released earlier
Yeah.
today prior to getting in front of the media that again just basically outlined the stance of the organization and how they were going to look to move forward?
Yeah, this came out around 11 o'clock Eastern, something like that. Then Sean Marks jumped in and did a press conference. We have some clips from that as well. He did just a quick presser with certain select media members where he took some questions. His initial, I'm not going to read the whole statement because it's kind of lengthy, but he said, given the evolving nature of the situation, we have decided Kyrie Irving will not play or practice with the team until he is eligible to be a full participant. Kyrie's made a personal choice. We respect his individual right to choose. He goes through and describes some of the regulations. I'm going to skip that. And then he says, it is imperative that we continue to build, there's interesting words here. It is imperative that we continue to build a chemistry as a team and remain true to our long established values of togetherness and sacrifice. That word sacrifice did not go without a little eyebrow raise for me. Our championship goals for the season have not changed. And to achieve these goals, each member of our organization must pull in the same direction. And then it goes on and talks about a few superlatives about getting started with the season.
Mhm.
When you read or heard that, did you have the same reaction I did? I know I kind of threw in my little 2 cents there around some of the words, but did that read the same way to you as it read to me, which was, well, guy, I won't even put it in your mouth. What did you think when you heard or saw those comments from Marks?
It feels like it ties into what Joseph Tsai said in his interview with Brian Lewis, right? That you mentioned some of the key words that you bring up. And I think more than anything, what you take away from it is the Brooklyn Nets didn't put this structure in place. It's the structure that they have to operate within. And there's no guarantee that in private conversations, other players had other decisions that they may have preferred to make. But the entire team, from top to bottom, outside of Kyrie, the entire organization has all agreed this is the direction we're going in. This is what it looks like for us to try to win a championship. And yes, maybe it means making a difficult decision and something that goes against some of your personal views, but that's the sacrifice that you make. Say sacrifice, double underline, when you play in the NBA and when you put together a team like this and you want to take advantage of the championship window that you have. I think it does. Again, the other piece being the foundation of this organization under Sean Marks. Like we talked about culture. It's a silly word, but they have built something here. And guess what? Kyrie, in a lot of ways, is a part of how that formulated. And maybe he has diverted from what feels like a collective focus. And this is the breaking point. We're staying on the track that we've established for ourselves. I can appreciate if you feel differently about something that's come up that we had no anticipation of, but this is where we're at, and we're staying on track. You've chosen to divert or get off at a station before our ultimate stop.
Yeah, that's how I read it. Yeah, I feel like I said this to Adam off there. I feel for kind of both sides in this situation. I think it's really unfortunate how this has gone. I can kind of, if we wanted to get into it, I won't get into it in this podcast for sure because I want to get to more Marx's things. I can definitely see some of Kyrie's stance on this piece. And but the problem here is though, what we know about Kyrie Irving, at least around I'm only judging it based on actions and reactions he's had to other things in the past since he's been on the Nets and just other things in his career. The track record on this does not look great in terms of
it's unforgiving, his track record.
It's just not. If you go back and look, if you took this one situation and looked at it in the context, there's probably there's the light can shine on a certain way. When you take the other pieces of his career that have gone sort of along these same lines around different situations, it becomes a little bit more like, what are we doing here to some degree? And I hate to say it that way because I kind of do see his point of view on some of this stuff, but or I can see where there'd be frustration, at least on this side of it, without having heard him say it. But the bottom line becomes like, this is a very clear line in the sand. The Nets chose this one path because they had you said they didn't have a path. There was a path of letting him play half the games. Like they could have done that, but I can see why they wouldn't want to, right? They weren't totally forced into it. I'm not disagreeing with what Marks does here. He makes some really salient points about why that's not a good idea. And so
yeah, I'm sure you can't go putting Kyrie. I mean, this is anybody. By the way, it's like, what if it had been Kevin Durant in these circumstances? But you just it's a very difficult circumstance to say we're elevating one individual above everyone else here. And then, by the way, all of the fallout from that, what does that look like? What is the strain that it puts on, just from a basketball standpoint? What is the strain it puts on the team? What is the strain that it puts on the rotations and the chemistry of the the teams that you put out on the court on a night-to-night basis? All of the spider web, I think, of impact on this. You can take it completely away from the personal side of it and the decision someone's making about any given thing. Like you say, that's for all podcast conversations. But as it specifically relates to basketball, it's hard to just take one of your top 3 players on your roster and say, we're going to have to navigate very uneven waters for an entire year. It's just, it's an impossible situation to go with.
I totally get why the Nets did it. I'm just saying that I'm saying the Nets still had a choice. Is all I'm saying. Like, I get they had a choice. They just chose to go this way, and I understand, given all of the context about why you would choose this way. I was just mostly just delineating whether they had a choice. There were still bits of this that were a choice. And I totally get why they did it. We'll get into more of Marx's reactions here. Some comments that he made, which are pretty interesting. First, got to talk to you about our friends over at Sweatblock. I read this announcement, buddy. In the past, I would have really started sweating. If it was the old Doug, the pre-Sweatblock Doug, I'm gushing right now. Not in the good way either. I'm in the change your shirt. We're on shirt number 2 when I read that Kyrie Irving might miss the season for the Brooklyn Nets, but not with Sweatblock, the best clinical antiperspirant out there. You may have seen a feature on Rachel Ray's show. A bunch of firefighters use this thing. No one gets hotter than those guys, and I know what it's like to have been sweating before in front of crowds where you need to change that shirt, or you're going to actually just pick your outfit based on what's going to hide the sweat the least, that or the most. That is not something you need to worry about anymore when you wear Sweatblock. It's a dry shirt guarantee. If it doesn't keep you dry, you're going to get your money back. Sweatblock is stronger and more effective than most clinical antiperspirants. You simply put it on before you go to bed. You wake up, you rinse off. The next morning, you go about your day, no sweat guaranteed. Right now, you can go to sweatblock.com. you can get 20% off. You have to use the promo code locked on, though. Locked on at sweatblock.com, or go over to Amazon and CVS. They have it there, but they put a little wind in our sails. Go to Sweatblock and use the promo code locked on for 20% off at sweatblock.com.
So then we talk about that's the initial statement that Sean Marks releases there, and then he gets on with the media, and we start to go through. I think there's a handful of, you said, interesting responses, things that kind of just maybe flesh out the thinking on it. The first one, I thought it was just, I mean, this is boilerplate, but Howard Beck from Sports Illustrated asked, this is a bit of an unprecedented situation, obviously, that they find themselves in as far as the NBA goes. Any anticipation on pushback from either the NBA itself, and obviously you assume that you have to go through certain channels for that. And then also Kyrie Irving in his camp, because this is not necessarily the outcome that Kyrie was hoping for.
Parties that needed to be consulted on this were, will there be pushback from Kyrie in his camp? I'm sure this is not a decision that that they like. And Kyrie loves to play basketball, wants to be out there, wants to be participating with his teammates. But again, this is a choice that Kyrie had, and he was well aware of that. Again, we had multiple conversations about this. I think the conversations were good. They were very clear and clearly outlined. And this is where we stand right now today.
Do you take from that, he kind of pushes past just as far as the NBA, because it seems obviously you can't make a decision like this without confirming that you're allowed to do it, and you're not going to get pushback maybe from the NBA PA. But did you take away this sense of, we've always wondered about what's been the communication behind closed doors? Do you think that whether either side was frustrated, that they were capable of having clear conversations around, this is where we're moving towards as an organization, this is where I'm moving towards as Kyrie Irving, and just trying to walk that path as far as they could?
It's hard to tell if this is just wanting to not say anything, and they had tons of conversations about it, and this is the way you say, hey, I don't know, I'm not going to talk about someone's feelings about a situation because it's not my place. I'm sure Sean Marks knows the feeling, and so, or whatever the feelings are, or has more insight into what the feelings from his side are than he was letting on in this press conference. I'd be shocked if that was the case. That being said, again, with Kyrie Irving, it's very hard to sometimes know what's going on here, right? It's hard to know what the levels of communication are. It's hard to know what is being passed back and forth. Again, we have other examples of this from the past where it's not been totally clear that all sides knew exactly what was going on. This is unvaccine related. Like, we've had other things that have happened, whether it be about injuries, whether it be about just not playing last year, right? There's been other stuff where it seemed like not everyone totally knew. I don't actually think they can get any pushback from the Players Association, because they said they're going to pay him. Like, they're going to pay him for the games. They're only not paying him for the home games. And so I think from that standpoint, there's really no Players Association recourse when it comes to the contract, because they're not withholding a season's worth of salary from him. They're going to withhold home games worth of salary because he didn't comply with local mandates. But it sounds like he's going to get paid for the away game. So I actually don't think that there's a Players Association grievance here at all, unless they were going to challenge the local ordinance, which it doesn't sound like they've done.
Yeah, the other one we'll jump in quickly was Brian Lewis asking about the salary piece, and then the
apologies, I stepped on
No, that's okay, because it just doesn't matter. It confirms that, and it also says about the part-time player aspect of it and what was possible, or what was at least considered as far as the Brooklyn Nets and what they were willing to do going into the season.
Salary that he loses, Greg, is going to be for the home games. That's it. Kyrie's made it clear that he has a choice in this matter, and it's ultimately going to be up to him what he decides. We respect the fact that he has a choice and he can make his own and right to choose. As again, right now, what's best for the organization is the path that we're taking. And I don't want to speak for Kyrie. At the right time, I'm sure he will address his feelings and what the path may be for him.
And that's also Greg Logan of Newsday, just to be clear, who was asking the questions there. But so it adds the salary piece, but that's still, what is it, close to $400,000 a game for every single home game this year.
Oh, it's a ton. It's a ton of money.
Significant amount of money to just be giving up. And I do wonder that calculation from a Brooklyn Nets standpoint, because now they didn't get to any of this stuff. And there's a follow up here we can get into in a minute around what else is possible this season. But I don't, that money comes back to Brooklyn now. Like, they suddenly have created some amount of salary, and I don't know if it's not dollar for dollar, right? I don't know what the flexibility is there potentially for the Nets should they look at the roster and say, how can we utilize this money in some form or fashion? I don't know.
It does. They don't have to pay the money, but it doesn't. They don't
Change their
get
cap.
relief on the. They don't get relief on the salary cap. Like that money. That money still sits on their cap. So it's one of these things where you can have it in the bank, but you don't get to go out and sign another player with that money. So it's not like they get any relief from that fashion and they're already over the salary cap anyway. So like they'll get like the checks. They're not going to write the checks, but it's not going to be like they can sign another player in his place for not playing him. And so
Right.
I think it's still he's probably on. What a mess! I don't even know. I think he's still. I think he's still on the active roster. I'm not really sure, but I don't know. They don't. I don't think they really Nets don't.
Well,
Let's be very clear. The Nets don't get anything out of this. This is terrible. They do not want this. This is a bad situation.
Yeah.
Like this
The
is
Nets aren't excited that they get to keep some money that they're not spending, but they're not paying a salary to. Like that doesn't matter. They're happy to be spending the money. They prefer to be paying Kyrie the full salary for the entirety of the season. But you mentioned that piece there too that you have to see here because some people were just speculating on what would be the next steps here as far as freeing up a potential roster spot and how you manipulate it. Is it a suspension for Kyrie? How would that be structured? And that's not any kind of message beyond it allows us to create a new roster spot over the course of the season because you're not going to be a part of the team. So that's maybe something that the Nets are going to be able to play with here and they probably don't have to do it in the short term, but they can certainly look at it as the season progresses.
Yeah, let's we can get a little bit more. I think we have one more Sean Marks clip I think to go before we get out of here. We got a couple other thoughts on this. I'm sure this is one in terms of the roster. My guess is this is one of these things that plays out over the course of the season, and we have a little more insight into like what maybe Kevin Durant and James Harden, their role, or if there was any kind of where they came into this whole process. Again, it's a mess all around, and definitely not a situation the Nets really, there's 100% they don't want to be in. Before we get to that, got to talk about our friends over at Bet Online. Bet Online is the number one place for all your pro and college football plus NBA action this season. They have really everything you can imagine: game odds, props, contests. They also have futures. If you head over to Bet Online right now, you might not want to see this. If you look at the NBA championship odds, the Nets have actually dropped a little bit. They were plus 220 2 weeks ago, and now down to plus 260. Still the odds on favorite on Bet Online, so you're okay there. But those odds have dropped a little bit as we head into the season. You go to Bet Online right now. You sign up today. You can get a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit, but you have to use the promo code Locked On, just like our podcast network. That's the only way you're going to get that. Football, basketball, boxing, that big one over this past weekend. Even some Vegas casino games. You can take advantage of all the offers at Bet Online. Bet Online is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your favorite sports. Bet Online, where the game starts.
So let's just hit. Yeah, we have two quick ones, but putting in context about what's next potentially for the Brooklyn Nets. Christian Winfield from New York Daily News followed up with Sean Marks asking about where do you go from here, and he did at least throw it out in the water of the possibility of a trade or a roster move of some kind around the situation.
I don't know that I want to address the hypotheticals of what may happen in the future here. I think this is pretty raw, pretty fresh. I think we've got to let the dust settle. The hope is that we have Kyrie back. We'll welcome him back in open arms under a different set of circumstances. And so we need to wait and see how that transpires. But in the meantime, we need to focus on the 16 players that are going to be on this roster moving forward, with us, including our two-ways. So the focus needs to be with them, and our goals have not changed. The goals, ultimately still are to be the last team standing.
So when you take away from that, the one thing I'll say is welcoming him back with open arms. Do you also think that there's a function of this, if you believe that there's active conversations between Kyrie and his camp and the Brooklyn Nets, that this is also the short-term answer to what can be an ongoing conversation? This is just, we're coming up against the season. This is how we're going to start the regular season. And we can continue to, at some point, potentially say, hey, welcome back, buddy. Like, good to have you here, whether it's through vaccination or an adjustment again of the local mandates in New York City. Okay, fine, whatever it may be. We're not going to start to. I didn't expect them to say anything like, "Yeah, we're going to think about possibly trading him." But would you put any stock in the idea that the Nets are as open to any possible option going forward, as opposed to maybe it's either he comes back or he doesn't play for the team this year, and we worry about this in the offseason?
I mean, the first vote, it has to be they want him back. I don't know how there's anything else than that's number one on the choice. They want him back under a circumstance where he can play full time. I think that's I don't even think that's a hot take. I think that's just got to be
No.
what the situation is. I will say that the positive piece of this is Ben Simmons walked back into the Sixers facility last night, and that's the old anything can happen category. And so, like, if that guy's walking back in and they're going to work it out, then I would say then this one isn't anywhere close to the animosity around that situation. So that gives me hope.
Well, I also dovetailed off of our conversation with Matt Brooks, who he wanted to get into that, the only possible trade scenario. I said, it's like the second time that I'm like, oh, suddenly Ben Simmons is going to be back in the fold and on the active roster. Interesting. Right as we come up against this difficult circumstance for the Brooklyn Nets, like I'll still leave, that little tiny
Yeah.
crack in the doorway at night when you're going to sleep and your parents say you're scared of the dark. Here's a little bit of light. I don't think that that's remotely going to happen. But to the bigger point being, Ben Simmons looked like he was as far away from being a part of this situation in Philadelphia as possible. And then all of a sudden it was like, guess what? It's going to cost you a lot of money. You want to be able to play basketball, whatever may come down the road for them. You got to come back into the fold and be a part of it. So if there was hope there, and there turned out to be, we have to think there's some hope in the situation for Kyrie.
And look, what do we know about athletes, right? We know that these guys are built different mentally than your average person that you have, a couple pints at the bar with on weekends, right? This is not
Yeah.
the same kind of situation. These guys are used to letting stuff sort of roll off their back. They have to. It's part of the gig. Some maybe hold on to it a little longer than others, but for the most part, most athletes that you really can't survive unless you're able to just sort of brush things off and go back in the next day. It's the nature of the business. You don't mentally, you would not get very far in this game if everything affected you for the long term. It's just not what happens, right? Look like Kevin Durant hated everything in Golden State, and he sits down with Draymond Green for an interview 2 years later, right? Looks
Right.
like Ben Simmons is never going to be a Sixer again, and then without even announcing it, walks back into the facility and gets a COVID test. Things change very quickly in sports. Things change very quickly in the NBA. The thing you think is going to have this long-lasting detrimental effect on relationships, these relationships do not work the same way, right? Like, it's just not the same. And so this is me being positive about the situation, by the way. Like, this is a positive
In
take.
case
This
you're
is
wondering, this
yeah,
is
because
rose-colored glasses. But I know what you, yeah, because it's
like
not
the part where some, your high school buddy said something about you and you still are pissed off at them 15 years later. And if you see him at the bar, you want to kick they're almost cursed.
yeah, keep
Kick
it.
their
Come
butt.
on,
Like,
buddy. It's a family show.
that was a close one. But that's what I'm saying. This is not the same. These guys do not get built this way. If
Right.
they did, they would not have made it. They would have snapped already. They would have snapped under the pressure of things going wrong. So I'm just from that point of view, I think I can be if it worked out tomorrow, I would have no doubt that everything would walk back in and these guys would be kumbayaing again pretty quickly.
Last thing before I get to, I think will end up being cliffhanger hypotheticals. Ian O'Connor from New York Post asked about, was KD, was James Harden, were players consulted on this decision? And did you feel like Kyrie put you in basically a zero sum, no other choice situation for the Brooklyn Nets and the organization as a whole?
Players were made aware that this was the trajectory we're going down, and this was going to happen. Again, I will let Kevin, James, Joe Harris, Blake Griffin, all the players address it in their own words at the right time. Our hope is that we can, somewhat put this to rest and move on with the season. Again, we have, goals and aspirations to go and achieve out there, and I don't think we want it to be focused entirely on an individual that is not with the team right now.
He goes on to say, essentially, because I don't want to go to belabor it, that Kyrie gave them no choice, as in with everything being considered and where the organization stood, where the players stood, this is what it looked like for us to be able to move forward from this. So in that regard, he was upfront about that. I mean, I think Sean Marks was as direct as you could be in terms of, yeah, that's the personal choice that he's making. He has every right to make it. And this is how it impacts our decision-making process and what we needed to do. The cliffhanger that I think I want to leave it on.
Real quick, let me say one more
ahead.
thing about that, because he mentioned there's one more thing we don't have a clip for. He did talk, and I actually do believe this part of it. When he started it, I thought, oh, this is going to be one of these sort of like superlative things, because he had said, oh, it's not fair to Kyrie either, and I was like, oh, okay, I don't know if anyone's going to want to hear that, but he did mention about how it wasn't fair when it comes to NBA players ramping up and getting game reps and being able to practice and being able to get into live game action. That was not a thing that you could really turn on and turn off for an NBA player, right? And so the part where if you're only around half the time or only playing in half the games or have to take long stretches from being out of game action, it would require other things than just saying, hey, you sit out for a week while we're on a homestand, and then you go back and play 35 minutes later in the next game on the road. Like, that's just not how it works. And so
Right. Player
he
gets
did.
hurt and misses a few games. Then they talk about you said ramping back up basketball activities, right? That's what they always use when a
Right.
guy's coming back. You'd
So, I
almost
mean,
have to
look,
at least have a little bit of that during the
I'm
year.
sure that's a little bit of I'm sure that's just a little bit of trying to have like some rose-colored glasses or making it seem like there was not that this was that was part of the decision. I thought it was a huge part. I do take a little bit part of that because it would require a lift around figuring out how to manage that they clearly just didn't want to do. Again, I think this was really far down the line of the reasons why they did it, but he did mention that as a piece about trying to be fair to Kyrie's own physical the physicality that the NBA season demands and not wanting to get into that part of it too. So that was just the
Yeah.
last part that he kind of mentioned.
Yeah, and to me, but again, it's like I think the way that Sean Marks addressed the media and in the statement is very much. It wasn't attacking Kyrie for his decisions, and but it was also making it very clear that they were taking the stance that they were as an organization, right? So I think that as far as navigating difficult waters, at least what it looks like on the surface is, listen, we were just honest, right? We're being honest, we're being direct. This isn't great. Doesn't mean that there isn't real frustration behind the scenes on both sides, right? But here we are, and I'm not going to come out here, by the way, and fire some shots in the press conference and take some digs at Kyrie's expense or something to send some other type of additional message. They've still played this very much above board, and I'll say like adults, right? It hasn't been any dirt getting kicked around here, or sand in the eyes from either side. It's just been, hey, this is the circumstance we have to deal with. I think we're going to get into next time we come back in. Now it's going to be looking at the rotations. And we said there could be some things to take away from that preseason game against the 76ers from that standpoint. How are the Nets going to manage now not having Kyrie Irving for the course of this season? Opens up obviously a massive hole in their roster. And then the big picture piece is, remember, the extension talks were just around the corner, right? That was all but sewn up. I do wonder what this looks like for the big three, the long-term prospects for this team. And maybe, we talked about, we're going to be set and locked into this team, or at least these guys, for the next handful of years once the extensions get signed. It could get reshaped next offseason. We could be talking about a different version of a very talented team in Brooklyn. And that's also maybe that's obviously the carryover effect of this and from last year, like Matt Brooks had talked about. There's a lot of situations here that I think have given the organization pause around if they want to be fully committed to this particular core going forward.
Yeah. This is just such a bummer. I'm so bummed. It's just such a, like, heading into the season on this note is such a massive bummer based on the, just the excitement and hype over the offseason. And I hate to end it on a bad note. I'm just like, this was, I really was.
Fan hat on. It sucks. Because remember, by the way, this has been thrown out. Remember, Kyrie had a career year last year. Like we talked about, out of these three guys, he's the guy that's literally at 29 years old about to knock into his prime, right? Like, this is going to be the pinnacle of Kyrie's game. And in theory, right now you're losing a prime year of one of the best players in the NBA. That's incredibly disappointing as a NBA fan, and then of course as a Nets fan.
He's like one of my favorite players to watch. He's a top 15 player in the league. He's like a top 5 offensive player, right? Like he's a top 2 when it comes to just him having the ball in his hands or whatever. Like this is just one of the most exciting players in basketball. We were heading into a season that was looking, by all accounts, the Nets were just going to be this absolute juggernaut. And now they go into this little, these question marks and this stuff hanging over them and this talking thing that's just not going to resolve itself anytime soon. And I don't know. I was feeling a little bit of hopeful over the weekend into the beginning of the week, and now I'm decimated, buddy.
Cam
I'm
Thomas, Cam Thomas. Let's all just start the rallying cry. I don't think that's the answer. Start the rallying cry.
Total consolation prize. Okay, we will be back again tomorrow. Really appreciate everyone making Locked On Nets your first listen. All these episodes are going up on YouTube. I think YouTube's going to catch this one faster than the podcast group will. So make sure you subscribe over onto the Locked On Nets YouTube channel. We're about 250 subscribers. We're trying to get to 1,000 in short order, a quarter of the way there. So help us out by liking and subscribing over on YouTube.
And hey, the suspense is killing me. I hope it'll last. William Wonka.
Oh, R.I.P. Is he still alive? One of the all-time great poets.
He is no longer with us.
We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.